Benvenuti al nuovo episodio di Illuminismo Psichedelico. Sono veramente felice di avere oggi qui con noi Rick Doblin, il fondatore e presidente di MAPS e ex membro del consiglio di amministrazione di Lykos Therapeutics. Ciao Rick, benvenuto.
Hey Rick, welcome to our podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Come è nato il tuo interesse per l'MDMA?
How did your interest in MDMA originate in the beginning?
I first learned about MDMA in 1982, and it was actually 1972 when I read a book by Dr. Stanislav Grof, Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research, that I was so inspired that I decided to focus my life on psychedelics, becoming a underground psychedelic therapist and trying to bring back the field and move into research. And so in 1972, when I did that, that was after the backlash. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act and psychedelic research was basically wiped out for several decades all over the world, not just in the United States. When I learned about MDMA in 1982, it was both a therapy drug, which it had started out as from the middle 70s under the name Adam, and it had escaped from that and had become ecstasy and started to be sold in a public setting. And I knew then that this was during the time of Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and the escalation of the drug war. So I knew that MDMA was going to be criminalized. And I thought now was an opportunity for me to get politically involved to try to protect the therapeutic use of MDMA and use that as an argument about the therapeutic potentials of psychedelic in general. When I first heard about MDMA, I really, this was now September of 1982, a woman, Debbie Harlow, was talking about it. It was still legal. And I was doing a month-long workshop at Esalen in Big Sur, California, with Stan Grof and Christina Grof. And what I was told is it makes you feel love, it helps you feel connection, it helps you to be a better listener, it helps you to reduce your fear. And I thought, okay, that's interesting, but it doesn't seem all that profound compared to classic psychedelics where your ego is dissolved and you can merge with something much larger than yourself. Then I saw a group of people in a circle doing MDMA and talking to each other. And I thought, how significant is this? Because when you take a large amount of LSD, you can't talk for a period of time. And that's also true for the psilocybin or, other classic psychedelics. You get to a place where words don't do justice. It's difficult to orient yourself from your ego. So there's periods of time you don't talk. So I like to say that I was foolish enough to underestimate the potential of MDMA, but smart enough to buy some. And I went home and did it with my girlfriend. And I discovered just how utterly profound it was in the way that we could speak to each other, in the way that we could listen to each other, the way we felt that we could express our deeper love for each other. And then I realized that even though it was very subtle, it was incredibly deep and profound. And I thought, I'm operating at a better level than I normally am, that this kind of is an improvement. I thought on the way that I process information and the way that I relate to someone else, the way that I relate to my internal feelings and thinking. And so I thought this is a wonderful tool for me to try to protect. And that's how it all began.
Sono venuto a conoscenza dell'MDMA per la prima volta nell'82, seppur avendone letto già nel 72 da un libro di Stanislav Grof. All'epoca l'MDMA stava subendo una quasi totale scomparsa, come il resto della terapia psichedelica, a causa delle policy antidroga del governo americano, soprattutto sotto il governo Reagan. E quindi la mia idea è stata di fare il possibile per cercare di salvare questa sostanza dalla scomparsa totale. Mi trovavo in un incontro sulla West Coast con Debbie Harlow, condotto anche con Stanislav Grof e sua moglie, e dove c'erano presenti delle persone in un cerchio che assunsero dell'MDMA. Una cosa che mi colpì molto fu la possibilità di comunicare sotto effetti di MDMA, una cosa che con altri psichedelici tende a scomparire, soprattutto in dosi più elevati. Quindi fu abbastanza intelligente da prenderne un po' e provarla in privato con la mia fidanzata, e ne scoprì gli effetti e rimasi molto impresso e decisi di fare di tutto per cercare di salvaguardare la terapia.
Perché secondo te condividere storie delle proprie esperienze personali, magari positive, con gli psichedelici è importante?
Why is it important to share stories of positive experiences with psychedelics?
Various people over the last 40 plus years have, from the federal government, have talked about in exaggerated ways about the risks of MDMA in order to help frighten people and in order to try to justify the incredible penalties that you get for MDMA, for which people go to jail. So there's been an effort to demonize MDMA, and people telling their stories, both about benefits and about situations that didn't work out as well, helps present a more balanced picture about what's really going on. It's very important for people to share their stories.
Varie persone, rappresentanti soprattutto del governo americano, negli ultimi 40 anni hanno gravemente esagerato gli effetti negativi dell'MDMA in ordine di far impaurire la popolazione, esercitare un po' di paura a livello collettivo sugli effetti negativi della sostanza. Quindi persone che ne parlano in modo aperto e positivo sono molto importanti contro la tattica di demonizzazione dell'MDMA.
Riguardo il tuo interesse per l'MDMA, in seguito al tuo interesse per l'MDMA, è nata MAPS. Come è nata MAPS e che cos'è MAPS?
How did MAPS come about? How was it born?
So in 1982 is when I learned about MDMA and decided to try to get politically involved to try to protect the therapeutic use. And a group of people were gathering together at Esalen in Big Sur, California, to try to strategize how to protect MDMA. And these were the early pioneers of psychedelic research during the 60s and some of the main advocates and underground therapists. And MDMA was still legal, so it was something that we could protect. So I started a nonprofit before MAPS in 1984. And this was a nonprofit that was affiliated with a scientist, Buckminster Fuller. And this was the organization that was used to gather resources to challenge the FDA, well, to try to start research at FDA, which was blocked, and also to challenge the Drug Enforcement Administration. And we were able to get a court case against the DEA to try to tell stories about the therapeutic use of MDMA and to try to challenge the risks that were being presented by the police in order to try to justify it. And we were winning in the court and winning in the court of public opinion. We eventually won the case, and the judge said MDMA should stay as a medicine. It should be illegal for recreational use, but stay as a medicine. But the Drug Enforcement Administration rejected the recommendation of the judge in order to try to keep it illegal for scientific research and medical as well as recreational. And that's where I knew that the only way to bring it back would be through the FDA. And so that's where I started MAPS in 1986, to go through the FDA as a non-profit psychedelic pharmaceutical company.
MAPS è nata da un'idea in seguito a un incontro a Big Sur, California, nel 1982, dove erano presenti vari pionieri della scena psichedelica degli anni 60, per cercare di creare un'entità legale con cui sfidare la Drug Enforcement Agency e la loro prassi di demonizzazione degli effetti dell'MDMA, del suo potere terapeutico. E quindi nel 1984 ho creato un'associazione no profit con Buckminster Fuller per inscenare un caso contro la DEA e avere un parere giuridico sulla sua legalità in ambito ricreativo e medicinale. Il caso è stato vinto, il tribunale ha deciso che l'MDMA doveva rimanere legale per usi terapeutici, però la DEA ha rigettato questa istanza e ha detto che non era possibile. Quindi nel 1986 ho creato MAPS per avere un'associazione legale e attraverso il processo FDA cercare di sfidare il concetto che aveva la DEA sulla questione.
Negli ultimi anni, oltre a MAPS, è nata Lykos. Intanto ti vorrei chiedere cos'è Lykos e anche perché poi ne sei uscito.
So in the years after Lykos was born, I'd like to know how was Lykos was born and why did you leave in the end?
So when I started MAPS in 1986, my understanding was that MDMA had been invented by Merck in 1912 and was therefore in the public domain, and nobody could patent MDMA. When I learned about MDMA in 1982, it had already been used by therapists for post-traumatic stress disorder, for couples therapy, for a wide range of anxiety related to having cancer, a wide range of different uses. So I thought that the uses of MDMA as a therapeutic tool were also in the public domain. And so I thought that MDMA would be a generic drug. There was no way to protect it, and or no way to patent it, like pharmaceutical companies do, and that it would immediately become a generic drug. And in that way, it would be impossible to raise money from investors, that it would only be through nonprofit. And maybe I'll stop here for a second so you can translate that, and then I'll get into the next part.
Nel 1986, con la creazione di MAPS, pensavo che l'MDMA, che fu inventata nel 1912 dalla casa farmaceutica Merck, fosse già una sostanza senza brevetto di pubblico dominio. Quindi per proteggere la molecola e più che altro anche attirare investitori, ho deciso di creare un'associazione che non fosse no profit per questo scopo. L'MDMA era già comunque in uso, scoperto presso moltissimi terapeuti per cure contro il PTSD, problemi di coppia e altri usi psicoterapeutici, però rimanendo underground.
Ok, go on.
Okay, so in 1996, I took a class at Harvard Law School from the leading regulatory lawyer in the United States, and he had written the textbook on food and drug law regulations. And I learned even more about what it meant to go through the FDA, what the FDA regulations were. Then my PhD from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard was focused on the regulation of psychedelics and marijuana. And I completed my PhD in 2001, and when I graduated, and that's where I thought that I knew pretty much everything that I needed to know, which, of course, I wouldn't say of course, but I was wrong about that. But I thought that after I completed my PhD, after I'd studied with the leading pharmaceutical lawyer, that I knew everything that was important about developing MDMA into a medicine. However, there was something very important that I missed. And I'll let you translate that, and then we'll say.
Nel 1986 ho assistito a alcune lezioni del professore che ha scritto le linee guida dell'FDA per l'approvazione di nuovi farmaci e ho iniziato a studiare cosa bisognava fare per concludere l'iter e avere l'approvazione dell'MDMA come un regolare farmaco approvato. Nel 2001 ho finito il mio PhD, pensavo di sapere quasi tutto sull'argomento, invece ho capito che c'erano delle cose che avevo mancato.
Okay.
So in 2014, now this is 28 years after MAPS was started. In 2014, we'd started the work with MDMA for PTSD in 2000. So this was 14 years after that. I had a conversation with a patent lawyer who works for Harvard Medical School and others, patenting new ideas. And we had a conversation, and he was saying that there was something that I had missed completely, that in 1984, 2 years before I started MAPS, President Ronald Reagan had signed a bill, the Hatch-Waxman Act, that provided incentives for developing drugs that were not patentable. And these incentives were called data exclusivity. It meant that you had exclusive use of your data if you were a sponsor in order to market the drug. Nobody could use your drug for 5 years. Nobody could use your data to market the drug as a generic for 5 years. And if you did studies in pediatric populations, people younger than 18, you got another 6 months of data exclusivity. So this was a period of 5.5 years, plus it would block the FDA from starting to review a generic manufacturer's information until after the 5.5 years was over, and that could take a half a year or more. So that there was this basically 6 years or more period of time where MAPS, the nonprofit, could make MDMA into a medicine and could sell it at prices higher than generics. That's when I realized that I could tell a different story to our donors, that the donations that we were receiving to try to make MDMA into a medicine for PTSD would give us a position where the nonprofit could make additional money from the sale of MDMA that could be used for more research and more public education. And so that's where I started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, the for-profit company focused on public benefit, not just on maximizing money, that was going to be 100% owned by the nonprofit. So I'll stop there and then continue after.
Nel 2014, 28 anni dopo la nascita di MAPS, ho avuto una conversazione con un avvocato specializzato nelle pratiche di brevetti all'Università di Harvard, che mi fece notare una cosa che non avevo mai considerato, che nel 1984 il presidente Reagan promosse una legge dove diceva che le nuove molecole da brevettare avevano un periodo di 5 anni e mezzo dove nessuno poteva usare i tuoi metodi, il tuo marketing e altre tattiche per la promozione di quella molecola. Quindi ho iniziato con la mia associazione for profit a cercare un modo di raccontare una storia migliore agli investitori di MAPS, onde avere più soldi poi per la ricerca e l'educazione sull'argomento.
Okay. Because what I had realized is that if we were to try to sell MDMA for a higher price, that the amount of money that might come in would be more than the donations that we were receiving. And we could not keep that inside the nonprofit. You'd lose our nonprofit status if we were making so much more money than donations from selling MDMA. So that's why we created this public benefit corporation. What happened then was that in 2017, we raised $30 million to do the research to complete the phase 3 studies. And that showed that there was a pathway through the FDA. We had come to agreement with the FDA on the protocol design. And many other companies started looking at this and saying, aha, we can take psilocybin through the FDA. We can make this a business. And so there started to be many, many psychedelic pharmaceutical companies that owned chains of clinics, various other companies in the field of psychedelics. And it became more difficult for us to raise donations because people were saying, look at all these ways that people are investing. This field can get money from investors now. You've cleared up all of these political obstacles, scientific obstacles. You've shown that it can work to go through the FDA. And now hundreds of psychedelic companies, $4 billion has been put into psychedelic companies just since 2020. But this was starting to happen in 2017, and it became more difficult for MAPS to raise donations. People were saying, why don't I just invest instead? And so to continue our work, I failed to raise the money from donors, and we had to take in investors. And that changed everything. And the investors then meant that we had to balance what's in the public benefit with what's returned to shareholders. And trade-offs started being made. The company was no longer just about public benefit. We had to respond to the investors. And I felt over time that the company was moving more and more away from public benefit. And therefore, the company wanted to move away from MAPS and become a pharma company, which I resisted. But over time, I realized that the decisions that the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation were making were not actually in the service of public benefit. They were more in the service of the investors. And I felt at that point in time that it was not good for MAPS to have MAPS's name associated with a company that I didn't think was upholding the values of public benefit that MAPS had created this company in order to do. And so that's why I agreed to let them change the name. Now, Lykos, I didn't choose it. I had nothing to do with choosing that name. But Lykos is the Greek word for wolf. And I'll stop there and explain more after.
Dopo aver raccolto i primi investimenti iniziali, avevamo capito che se incominciavamo a commercializzare l'MDMA come un farmaco, le nostre entrate finanziarie sarebbero state di gran lunga superiori alle donazioni degli investitori. Quindi abbiamo dovuto fare un'altra sottoazienda for profit per questo caso. Quindi nel 2017 abbiamo raccolto $30 milioni per la fase 3 del studio FDA, e lì abbiamo capito che c'era una via attraverso l'FDA per poter arrivare alla approvazione e legalizzazione dell'MDMA come farmaco terapeutico. Allo stesso tempo, però, altre compagnie, avendo notato il nostro lavoro, hanno incominciato a proporre altre molecole psichedeliche, dicendo, ok, se l'hanno fatto con l'MDMA, lo possiamo fare anche con la psilocibina, con altre molecole ancora. E quindi lì abbiamo incominciato ad avere meno donazioni, perché il parco, l'offerta delle compagnie era più vasta e le donazioni hanno incominciato a scarseggiare, quindi non abbiamo centrato l'obiettivo dell'ultima raccolta finanziaria e abbiamo dovuto chiamare a bordo degli investitori. Una volta chiamato a bordo degli investitori abbiamo dovuto bilanciare MAPS tra le nostre prerogative e le loro prerogative come investor, e quindi, sapendo io che MAPS non rispondeva più semplicemente alla sua descrizione di una cosa di pubblico benefit, di bene per il pubblico, di comune accordo con gli investitori abbiamo deciso di cambiare nome e scegliere il nome Lykos, che in greco vuol dire lupo.
All right. So the name Lykos was chosen to show connection. Sorry. So the name Lykos was chosen because when I was 21 years old to 23 years old, I had raised a wolf. And I had spent a lot of time with this wolf. I got him when he was just 8 weeks old. He was an Alaskan timber wolf. And I learned a lot from him. And we had a wonderful relationship. When he was 2 years old, a wolf sanctuary opened up with a female wolf that needed a mate. So I gave him away so he could be among other wolves. So the name Lykos was chosen to sort of go reference to the origins of this company with MAPS and with me. But when I was, it was still MAPS Public Benefit Corp. And I was thinking that it wasn't really acting in ways to maximize public benefit the way that I thought it should be. There's an expression, I'm not sure if you have it in Italian, but the expression is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It means something, disguised. So it was a wolf, the way it acted as a traditional pharmaceutical company, but it looked like MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, like it was actually putting public benefit first. So I said it was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now that it has changed its name to Lykos, it's a wolf in wolf's clothing. And it is the goal of Lykos to be like a traditional pharmaceutical company. And I don't think that really public benefit is the primary motivation anymore. And that makes me very sad.
Quando avevo 21-23 anni mi capitò di salvare un cucciolo di lupo, un lupo selvatico dell'Alaska, da cui ho imparato molto durante una bellissima relazione. Quando il lupo aveva 2 anni scoprì che vicino a casa mia aprì un santuario, la protezione degli animali selvatici, dove avevano una femmina di lupo in cerca di un compagno maschio, e quindi decisi di affidarglielo a loro per formare una coppia. Dopo utilizzai quest'idea del nome del lupo per cercare di cambiare immagine pubblica a MAPS, farla sembrare in pubblico un qualsiasi lupo finanziario di Wall Street, diciamo, però che si comportava come una pecora in realtà, poi nel suo lavoro giorno per giorno. Purtroppo oggigiorno Lykos è diventata un lupo in veste di lupo, e abbandonando un po' la più tradizionale impronta di public benefit che lui volevo dare io all'inizio.
La scorsa estate la FDA ha bocciato la fase 3 degli studi sulla psicoterapia assistita con MDMA presentata da Lykos. Ora io ti farò un po' di domande su questo. Prima del giudizio finale una commissione indipendente aveva espresso un parere molto netto dicendo che i rischi sarebbero stati superiori ai benefici. prima di tutto, secondo te Lykos ha commesso errori?
Last summer, the FDA rejected the phase 3 studies on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy presented by Lykos. Now I have a few questions about this. Before the final judgment, an independent committee expressed a very clear opinion, stating that the risks would outweigh the benefits. First of all, do you think Lykos made any mistakes in this process?
Yes, Lykos made some major mistakes, but it was not in the design of the studies. The major mistake that Lykos made was to refrain from responding to critics in scientific journals and in the media and in other organizations that reviewed the potential price for MDMA if it would be approved. Lykos tried to act like a traditional pharmaceutical company and tried to say we need a quiet period, meaning we will not respond to criticisms. Not only that, because I was on the board of directors of Lykos, they said that they could control everything that I said or that MAPS said, and they convinced some members of the MAPS board of directors to agree to impose a silent period on MAPS and on me as well. So the traditional pharmaceutical people at Lykos didn't defend the therapeutic approach, didn't defend how the FDA actually chose the design for the phase 3 studies, didn't explain about how they were going to be operating in ways that responded to criticisms. And it created a vacuum. And in that vacuum was filled with negativity. And Lykos lost control of the narrative, over the story. And so they made the fundamental mistake to assume that culture didn't matter, that all that mattered was rational thinking and the data. And the data was excellent. And they decided that this quiet period, which I objected to, was the way that normal pharmaceutical companies acted, which is voluntary. It's not necessary. And it doesn't apply when you have a drug that's so widely used around the world that people already know about. And so Lykos essentially disarmed itself, and the negativity grew. And that's what influenced the FDA advisory committee more than the scientific data. And there's another thing I'll share after this is translated about that.
Sì, uno dei grandi errori di Lykos è stato di smettere di rispondere alla comunità scientifica e agli esperti dell'FDA e imponendo inoltre un periodo di silenzio stampa. Ciò ha iniziato a creare un clima di negatività tra Lykos e l'FDA. Io stesso, facendo parte del board of directors, sono stato oggetto di un gag order, un ordine di silenzio pubblico, onde rispondere alle critiche pubbliche solamente con i dati delle nostre ricerche. Ciò non ha fatto altro che aumentare ancora di più il clima di sfiducia tra le due parti, e Lykos ha perso un po' il filo del discorso.
Okay, so, let me add one aspect to this. The FDA advisory committee met on June 4th. This was after a lot of negative media articles, negative criticism in scientific journals that Lykos did not respond to. And so on June 4th, the FDA advisory committee recommended against approving MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. Now, MAPS, Public Benefit Corp, had conducted research in the US, Israel, and Canada for our phase 3 studies. But we had also begun research throughout Europe, in multiple countries in Europe, and had negotiated with the European Medicines Agency. We had research in the Czech Republic, in the Netherlands, in England, in Germany, Norway, and Lykos, at this point, the MAPS Public Benefit Corp decided to shut down all the research in Europe and just focus on the FDA. The Dutch government had seen very important benefits to the use of MDMA in our early studies in the Netherlands. And when Lykos shut down in Europe, they organized a committee to look at the scientific data. It was called the Dutch State Committee on MDMA. And it was the Dutch version of the FDA Advisory Committee meeting. The difference is that they had real subject matter experts who knew what they were talking about when it comes to psychedelic research and psychedelic psychotherapy. They spent a year reviewing the same data that the FDA Advisory Committee spent about 3 weeks reviewing, and they had to justify their findings in a book-length report about their results of their review, which they published on June 6th, 2 days after the FDA Advisory Committee meeting. And the Dutch committee was completely the opposite. They said, yes, efficacy was proven. Safety was proven. And because this is meeting an unmet medical need, the Dutch government should approve what they called naturalist studies, compassionate use. So the Dutch State Committee was exactly the opposite of the FDA Advisory Committee. And on October 3rd, the Dutch Parliament Committee on Mental Health met and accepted the recommendations of the Dutch committee to open up naturalist studies. But Lykos decided not to let people know about the Dutch State Committee. And I think that was a big problem because the Dutch State Committee was a scientific body that looked at the same data as the Advisory Committee meeting and came to the opposite conclusion.
Il 4 giugno un comitato dell'FDA, in seguito a un periodo molto negativo di poca comunicazione tra di loro e Lykos, ha dato un parere negativo. Mi preme puntualizzare che Lykos ha eseguito gli studi della fase 3, non solo negli Stati Uniti, ma anche in altri paesi come Israele, l'Inghilterra, Germania, Norvegia, Olanda, Repubblica Ceca. E soprattutto in Olanda il governo ha deciso di mettere in piedi un comitato scientifico per lo studio e la valutazione dei stessi identici dati scientifici che l'FDA aveva in suo possesso. 2 giorni dopo l'espressione negativa dell'FDA sulla fase 3, il comitato scientifico olandese ha detto esattamente il contrario, che sì, questa terapia può essere molto utile, che funziona, che i dati sono empirici e sono lì per tutti, e che quindi il governo olandese dovrebbe approvare una serie di leggi per l'uso terapeutico di medicine naturali o nuove terapie psichedeliche. Purtroppo Lykos ha voluto, diciamo, nascondere queste news provenienti dall'Olanda, rovinando ancora di più il rapporto fra la comunità scientifica e il parere scientifico dei governi.
Devo cambiare l'ordine. Ora, forse questa non è una domanda giusta per te che sei americano, però dato che la commissione indipendente olandese aveva dato questo parere positivo alla terapia con MDMA, non trovi che in fondo non sia per forza necessario passare dalla FDA per l'approvazione di un farmaco? Magari si potrebbe proporre questo percorso anche in altre parti del mondo per l'approvazione, no?
An independent Dutch committee gave a positive opinion last summer on MDMA assisted therapy, like you were saying. Could this have been emphasized more by Lykos instead of shunning away their research?
Yes, it should have been. It was a major mistake that Lykos and their PR people made not to talk about the Dutch State Committee, which they acknowledge now was a mistake, but it's too late. So the hope is in Italy and other countries in Europe that they will follow the Dutch State Committee's recommendation and open up compassionate use in multiple countries throughout Europe. I don't know if that's possible in Italy. I'm curious what you think about that. But what we would like to do is build on the Dutch State Committee's recommendation to open up compassionate use and try to do so in multiple countries in Europe.
Ok, io penso che al momento per la terapia con la MDMA in Italia sarebbe difficile e non so se è una domanda proprio giusta per te, però quello che penso io sinceramente è che non occorre passare per forza per la FDA per l'approvazione di un farmaco psichedelico, si potrebbe fare anche in altri parti del mondo, tu sei d'accordo?
At the current state, I see it very difficult, especially with our government nowadays in Italy, to go on a similar path here in Italy to have MDMA approved. But I was thinking, couldn't it be possible to entirely avoid going through the FDA approval system in other countries? Is it reasonable to think that maybe other political entities or other countries could do without the FDA?
It's possible. In Australia, the Australian government has said that they will approve, again, compassionate use of MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, for PTSD, and psilocybin for treatment-resistant and major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression. So Australia has moved forward to provide a way for access before the FDA. Canada also has approved a special access program for compassionate use for MDMA and psilocybin. In Switzerland, there's a similar program for MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD. So other countries could, if they wanted to, start providing access on a compassionate basis right away without waiting for the FDA. That's not the same as making it into a medicine covered by national health insurance, but that's a step in the right direction. And so I guess I'm curious if you think that's at all possible in Italy.
Sì, è possibile. Paesi come l'Australia hanno fatto una loro serie di leggi per approvare per uso compassionevole l'uso di MDMA per il trattamento del PTSD e della psilocibina per la depressione cronica farmacoresistente. Il Canada a sua volta ha una serie di leggi per uso compassionevole di farmaci psichedelici, come anche in Svizzera, dove è possibile condurre studi con MDMA, LSD, psilocibina. Quindi sì, si può fare se i singoli paesi hanno una volontà politica di procedere, non per far diventare ovviamente l'MDMA come una medicina tradizionale, facilmente acquistabile in farmaci o altro, ma per una terapia ben mirata. Quindi sì, si potrebbe fare e sarei curioso di sapere cosa pensi te delle possibilità in Italia.
Io lo dico, tu traduci. Allora, in Italia in questo momento non sono attivi studi clinici, quindi su umani, sull'MDMA, credo. Quello che stiamo facendo adesso in Italia te lo posso raccontare perché io ne sono parte e stiamo cercando abbiamo lanciato una campagna con l'associazione Luca Coscioni, che è una che si occupa di politica extraparlamentare, quindi di diritti umani, diritti della scienza. Abbiamo lanciato una campagna per permettere che la psilocibina possa essere utilizzata come cura palliativa o trattamento compassionevole per il fine vita, quindi per i malati terminali. Quindi in Italia stiamo cercando di fare questo, te lo posso dire perché una delle persone che sta cercando di farla sono proprio io.
In Italy, at the moment, we do not have currently running studies on MDMA or other psychedelic compounds. we only have, and I can tell you this because I'm part of it, an association called the Lykos that is trying to promote the use of psilocybin in end-of-life care or for late-stage cancer or other health problems for compassionate use. At the moment, we are just trying to set the base of talk and bring it to public attention. And we are the only ones doing it.
Wow. Is there any research taking place in Italy at all with psilocybin or any other psychedelic?
In questo momento, a quanto ne so, non su pazienti umani.
At the moment, we do not currently have any studies on humans or in vitro.
Ma
Okay.
siccome esiste... I finish. Siccome esiste il principio del diritto alla scienza, che è un principio dell'ONU internazionale, insomma, noi in Italia possiamo utilizzare risultati che sono validi altrove, per cui per quanto riguarda la validità della psilocibina nel fine vita ci sono risultati in Svizzera, in Canada, negli Stati Uniti, in Australia, e dunque come questi risultati sono solidi in questi altri paesi li possiamo usare anche qui. E secondo noi, secondo la legislazione per come è scritta ora, già si potrebbe fare, ma ancora non si fa questo per i pazienti italiani. Noi stiamo cercando di farlo fare, però ricerche, a quanto ne so, in questo momento non ci sono.
Based on the UN principle of self-determination for scientific needs, in Italy we could use the results of scientific studies like the ones you have run in Australia, Canada, Switzerland as a basis to set up a protocol for the use of these compounds in Italy. At the moment, currently, nobody has started, or maybe there's missing some political will to set up a non-profit to do the path forward.
Is S-ketamine, Spravato, available in Italy?
Yes, it is.
And
can I make some questions to you?
Okay, go ahead.
We will see in Rovereto. We can talk about that, but I have to make some questions to you now. Tra i problemi che ci sono stati nello studio c'è stata l'impossibilità di mantenere un doppio cieco. Un problema che invece ci sarebbe potuto essere anche nel caso dell'esketamina che citavi ora e che invece in quel caso appunto non si è verificato. Cosa ne pensi?
Among the issues that arose was the inability to maintain a double blind in the study conducted by MAPS together with FDA, Lykos together with FDA. A problem that was kept quiet, exactly in the case of what you were asking now. A problem that was kept quiet in the previous case of S-ketamine. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely S-ketamine was not conducted in a double-blind way. We negotiated with the FDA for 8 months in 2017 about how to address the challenge of conducting a successful double-blind study with MDMA, which has such a strong subjective effect that you know if you've taken it. In my dissertation in 2001, I had studied the double-blind problem and had come to the conclusion that the best design would be therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. Everybody would know they would get MDMA. Everybody would have the same expectation to get MDMA. They just wouldn't know the dose that they got. And so there would be some confusion between the full dose and the lower dose, and that would be the double blind. MAPS spent 16 years studying therapy with no MDMA, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 100, 125, and 150 milligrams. And what we were looking for was, first off, what is the ideal therapeutic dose? But then also, what is the dose for the control condition that's high enough to cause some confusion with the full dose, but not so high that it would be so therapeutic that there would be no differences between the two groups. So I'll stop there and finish more after that is translated.
Sì, sicuramente lo studio dell'esketamina / spravato non è stato un studio double blind. Noi abbiamo passato 8 mesi di trattative con l'FDA proprio per affrontare questo problema dello studio double blind. Come tu ben saprai, gli effetti dell'MDMA sono effetti molto soggettivi, quindi la mia idea è stata sviluppata su 16 anni di ricerche all'interno di MAPS di dare una dose molto bassa, dove tutti i pazienti sottoposti allo studio double blind sapevano che stavano ricevendo MDMA, sapevano gli effetti e sapevano la dose, e altri invece sapevano che avrebbero assunto dell'MDMA all'interno dello studio, ma non la dose. Quindi il double blind era questo, era lo studio del vedere tra chi prendeva una dose maggiore o minore la differenza degli effetti. Abbiamo condotto più di 20 anni di ricerche a partire da 0 mg, scalando di 25 mg a salire, per cercare di vedere quale fosse la dose migliore per la terapia, e anche quella dove c'era una sottile linea di confusione, dove il paziente non riusciva a indovinare veramente qual era stata la dose somministrata lì.
Go on.
Okay. What we discovered, to my surprise, after 16 years of this research, is that I was half right in my suggestion and half wrong. So we showed that the lower doses of MDMA, 25, 30, 40, 50 milligrams, could cause a certain amount of confusion with a fuller dose. But the lower doses had an anti-therapeutic effect, meaning that they activated people to think about their traumas, but they didn't reduce the fear enough. So it made people uncomfortable. People still got better, meaning they still improved and reduced their symptoms of PTSD, but the people that got therapy with no MDMA did better, more reductions of PTSD, than the people that got therapy with low dose. Then we discovered, to our surprise, that the 75 milligram dose group, lower than we thought, was very effective. We did one study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers where one group got 30 milligrams, one group got 75 milligrams, and one group got 125 milligrams. And the 75 milligram dose group did better than the 125 even in that group. So there was no dose that we could find that didn't either compromise the therapy as compared to no MDMA at all, or didn't start to help the therapy a lot. So we went to the FDA and we said, we can give you blinding if you want it, but you're going to make our job easier to find a difference between the two groups. It will be harder for us to find a difference if we do therapy with no MDMA compared to therapy with low dose MDMA. So actually, our dedication to doing the best scientific job, which the FDA accepted and chose therapy with no MDMA versus therapy with full dose MDMA, the FDA chose that in full awareness of the problem of functional unblinding. And then that's what we got criticized for later, because the people we negotiated with at the FDA in 2017 left the FDA, and new people who are more conservative took over. And so it would have been better if we were less committed to science and said, okay, we'll give you the blinding, even though it's going to make our job easier. And now that's probably what we should have done, because then people wouldn't have been able to say, oh, the blinding was terrible and we can't trust your results.
Ho scoperto a mie spese di essere mezzo corretto e mezzo in errore Sulla parte pratica delle dosi da utilizzare nello studio double blind, abbiamo visto che dosi di 25, 30, 50 mg creavano più confusione di dosi più alte di MDMA, ma avendo allo stesso tempo anche un effetto antiterapeutico, perché le persone riportavano effetti come confusione, come mantenimento delle paure che avevano prima della terapia, e subito dopo abbiamo quindi capito che una dose più alta sarebbe stata più effettiva di una dose bassa. Con questi dati siamo andati dall'FDA e gli abbiamo detto: noi possiamo fornirvi uno studio double blind con la differenza tra le dosi e la differenza tra una dose maggiore di MA e nessuna dose nello studio double blind. E loro hanno accettato, sapendo ovviamente anche dei rischi, degli effetti negativi, per cui siamo stati criticati in seguito dall'FDA. Questo è accaduto perché nel 2017 all'interno dell'FDA ci sono stati molti cambiamenti di posizione e sono subentrate persone ben più conservative degli esperti con cui avevamo a che fare prima.
È possibile che altre case farmaceutiche, cioè che delle case farmaceutiche abbiano fatto delle pressioni per una non approvazione della terapia assistita con MDMA proposta da voi?
Is it possible that other pharmaceutical companies have exerted some kind of pressure for the non-approval of the MDMA-assisted therapy proposed by MAPS?
Well, proposed by Lykos now. I don't think so. I actually don't think that there was pressure from other pharmaceutical companies. I think the failure was Lykos not explaining and defending what we were doing and adopting this quiet period. And so I think it's a self-inflicted wound. I don't believe it's from other pharmaceutical companies trying to influence the FDA advisory committee. I think whenever you do something novel, something new, something that's been controversial, you need to proactively be educating the FDA, educating the public, educating scientific journals about what you're doing and why. And when you stop doing that, the fears, the criticisms that come, and then you don't respond to that, that's what I think led to the disaster of the FDA rejection. So I don't think that we could point to other pharmaceutical companies. I think we can point to the traditional pharma people that ended up taking over decision-making at Lykos for trying to act in a traditional way for something that was new, novel, and not traditional.
Non penso che altre compagnie farmaceutiche abbiano esercitato una pressione sull'FDA per la non approvazione del MDMA. Penso che l'errore principale è stato di Lykos, che non ha spiegato, non si è voluta spiegare alla comunità scientifica, alle persone coinvolte su una cosa novella, su un argomento mai trattato prima. Quindi penso che devi essere proattivo nello spiegare, educare e far girare la voce sul procedimento, in questo caso, essendo per l'appunto una prassi del tutto novella. L'errore alla fine è stato della comunità scientifica all'interno di Lykos, le persone provenienti dal ramo farmaceutico che hanno voluto mantenere questo periodo di silenzio, dove si è creato un clima di sfiducia che sfortunatamente ha portato al disastro della non approvazione.
Secondo te c'è bisogno di un cambio di paradigma per quanto riguarda la valutazione dell'efficacia dei farmaci psichedelici? E come si potrebbe ottenere questo cambio di paradigma, se sì?
Do you reckon that we need a paradigm shift regarding the evaluation of efficacy of psychedelic compounds for therapy? what do you think could be done to change the paradigm, to change the everlasting old way of thinking?
Well, I think that we had the paradigm shift when we negotiated with FDA back in 2017. Lykos has hired a new person to be in charge of the drug development of MDMA. This new person, David Huff, came from developing S-ketamine, Spravato, into a medicine without therapy. What he has said is that the double-blind idea fails in a lot of different kind of studies. He specifically talked about research with schizophrenia, where the drugs that are given have such strong side effects that people know that they've taken them. It's also true with SSRIs, with Prozac and Zoloft, other medicines for depression and PTSD, that those studies also have major side effects that people can tell whether they're on the placebo or on the drug. So the whole idea of the double-blind study is an important concept, but in practice, it often fails, even with traditional drugs that are not psychedelics. So I do think that there has to be a reevaluation of how blind studies are actually, how blind these studies actually are, even with traditional medicines. And so I think the decision of the FDA in 2017 to do therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA was the right decision. Then I think it wasn't explained and defended by Lykos, and then the FDA new people were more conservative. So I do think that there needs to be a reevaluation of how you actually can do a double-blind study. And in many cases, it doesn't work very well at all. So I think that there does need to be a reevaluation of that. And what the FDA said in 2017 was that when the double-blind fails, there was two main ways, they said, to reduce experimenter bias. One is random assignment. Everybody is similarly motivated. And the other is independent raters who are blind to whether somebody is in the MDMA group or in the control group doing the evaluation of the PTSD symptoms. And both of those things we did, and they worked very, very well. So I believe our results were completely trustworthy and demonstrated efficacy. And that's what the Dutch State Committee also agreed. But I do think that the double-blind concept needs to be looked at much more closely because it fails more often than it succeeds.
Non penso che dobbiamo cambiare quello, ma penso precisamente che dobbiamo cambiare anche paradigma su come conduciamo i studi in double blind, perché spesso e volentieri questi studi nella realtà oggettiva falliscono o hanno dei problemi, come nel caso dei farmaci SSRI o farmaci contro la schizofrenia, che sono farmaci talmente potenti che anche in uno studio double blind i pazienti sentono che in realtà non hanno ricevuto un placebo ma il vero compound attivo, e quindi lì il double blind perde la sua efficacia perché non puoi più nascondere l'effetto di un farmaco al paziente. Nel 2017 con l'FDA abbiamo appunto proposto durante il processo di approvazione altri metodi come dei counselor esterni che non potevano valutare l'efficacia del processo, o anche dei counselor esterni che non erano informati su chi e non chi avesse ricevuto effettivamente l'MDMA durante lo studio double blind. Quindi non penso che dobbiamo cambiare tanto paradigma su approvazione, ma dobbiamo proprio cambiare paradigma su come conduciamo i studi in double blind per questo tipo di farmaci.
Okay, 3 more questions and that's it. Nel caso di Lykos è stata proposta una psicoterapia facilitata dal farmaco. La psicoterapia era dunque un po' al centro della proposta, benché non ci siano molti dati a supporto di questa cosa. Da quanto ne so, non ci sono prove scientifiche dell'utilità della terapia assistita con psichedelici, anche se intuitivamente se ne capisce il senso, anche solo per una questione di riduzione del danno. Questo tipo di effetto, cioè quello della psicoterapia assistita, può essere misurato?
In the case of MAPS, Lykos, drug facilitated psychotherapy was proposed. So somewhat psychotherapy was at the center of this proposal. Although there is no data supporting this. Moreover, in MAPS results, the control group, which did not receive the drug but only the psychotherapy, responded decently. As far as I know, there is no scientific evidence for the effectiveness of psychedelic assisted therapy, even if intuitively it makes sense, even if only in terms of harm reduction. Can this type of effect be measured?
Well, first off, I completely disagree with what you said, because the control group, the people that got therapy without any MDMA at all, did very well. The therapy that we have is very effective. In fact, the results suggest that the therapeutic approach that we have, even without MDMA, is more effective than the traditional therapies for PTSD. Cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, have very high dropout rates. It's re-traumatizing to talk about your traumas over and over. Around 50% of the people drop out of studies with prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. And we have a very low dropout rate. But when you look at the therapy plus MDMA, the difference is highly statistically significant. So we have proven in our phase 3 studies that when you add MDMA to the therapy, as compared to the therapy without MDMA, that the results are much better. And it was in our first study, a 1 in 10,000 chance that it was random, that the MDMA added to the therapy was statistically more effective than the therapy by itself. In the second phase 3 study, it was 1 in 2,500 that it was random. When you combine those two together, it's a 1 in 25 million chance that it was random, that when you add MDMA to therapy, it's substantially better. So the results of our study conclusively demonstrate the efficacy of MDMA with therapy over therapy without MDMA.
Vorrei dire che non sono d'accordo con ciò che hai appena detto, perché noi abbiamo notato che la nostra terapia, sviluppata all'interno di MAPS e dopo Lykos, è in effetti una terapia molto effettiva, più delle tecniche tradizionali che trattano problemi come PTSD o depressione cronica. Le tecniche tradizionali hanno circa un 50% di possibilità che i pazienti abbiano un dropout, cioè che smettano con la terapia, mentre la nostra terapia sviluppata con l'uso dell'MDMA ha dei valori molto più bassi, quindi i pazienti concludevano il loro periodo terapeutico. Quando aggiungi MDMA alla terapia c'è una probabilità di 1 su 10.000 che fosse random, quindi quando combini vari dati così, in nostro possesso in realtà c'era una possibilità ogni 25 milioni che la nostra terapia fosse meno effettiva della terapia tradizionale, quindi vorrei dire che è empiricamente provato che è più tradizionale il nostro metodo.
Ok, però non sarebbe comunque più facile provare a far approvare degli psichedelici come farmaci senza la psicoterapia, che costituisce una variabile molto difficile da valutare?
Wouldn't it be easier to try to get psychedelics approved as drugs without the psychotherapy, which constitutes a very important but very difficult to evaluate variable?
It's not that difficult to evaluate. But I would also say that I think it's unethical to provide people with severe PTSD MDMA or psilocybin or ketamine without any kind of support at all. So I don't think that that's an ethical way to proceed. One of the criticisms of the Lykos study by the FDA Advisory Committee meeting was that 40% of the people in the study had prior experience with ecstasy. Now, what they were saying was that made this 40% people could be more likely to have good outcomes because they liked MDMA and that's why they volunteered, and they would have fewer side effects. However, when we compared to the 60% that had never done MDMA, the results were the same on both safety and efficacy. But in addition to that, the 40% of the people that had prior experience with MDMA still had PTSD. So it's not just about the drug. And we have heard multiple stories from people that take MDMA in a recreational setting, remember trauma, are not in a position to process it, and end up feeling worse off for months and months afterwards. So to give somebody MDMA without any kind of therapy doesn't seem to us to be an ethical approach. Plus, if it's approved as a drug without therapy, insurance is not likely to cover therapy. So it's better to try to study the drug plus therapy. Our goal was, what is the best outcomes we can get for the patients? And when you combine the drug with therapy, that's how you get the best outcomes.
Non penso che le variabili della psicoterapia siano molto difficili da valutare in questo caso. Inoltre penso che sarebbe anche poco etico dare MDMA a persone in terapia senza l'uso insieme a psicoterapia tradizionale riconosciuta a livello scientifico. Il 40% dei nostri pazienti dei studi double blind avevano già provato ecstasy nelle loro esperienze passate ed erano sicuramente più proni ad avere effetti positivi dalla terapia. Noi pensavamo più dell'altro 60% dei pazienti coinvolti. Invece i dati ci hanno mostrato che in realtà il 60% degli altri pazienti era più prona ad avere effetti migliori grazie anche soprattutto alla terapia, come in caso del PTSD. Inoltre ci sarebbe anche un problema di fondo per cui le assicurazioni mediche, in questo caso stiamo parlando del sistema sanitario americano, non accetterebbero mai di dare soldi a una terapia psichedelica che non preveda anche l'uso di terapia più tradizionale, in questo caso la psicoterapia.
Ok, una cosa che voglio dire, io ovviamente sono a favore del sostegno della psicoterapia, mi chiedevo proprio se fosse tecnicamente per la comunità scientifica più difficile da valutare.
So I am very in favor of the use of psychotherapy in this case. I was just thinking, is it harder for the scientific community to evaluate its use when used together with a psychedelic compound as MDMA?
The FDA has already approved certain drugs for the treatment of addiction in combination with therapeutic support. There are other drugs that are approved in combination with different procedures. So it is not that complicated for the FDA to approve a drug plus therapy. The FDA said they don't regulate psychotherapy, but they don't need to. The FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. What that means is once a drug is approved for one condition, the doctors can prescribe it for anything they want to, not just for what it's approved for. So if it's combined with therapy, once the therapists have been trained in the method that was used in the phase 3 studies, then they're free to practice therapy however they want. So I think this was used by the FDA as a convenient excuse for not wanting to do something novel or new. But the FDA has it within its power to approve psychedelics with psychotherapy and leave the regulation of psychotherapy to the state regulatory bodies that license therapists, to the sponsor that develops the psychotherapy. So it's a failure of the FDA, but they can indeed approve combination treatments of drug plus therapy.
In realtà l'FDA ha approvato diversi medicinali da usare in combinazione con tradizionale psicoterapia, quindi hanno già il modus operandi per l'approvazione di qualsiasi medicinale a questo scopo. Esistono già in commercio vari esempi. L'FDA non regola l'uso medico delle molecole, quindi regola semplicemente il lato scientifico, ma non dice queste molecole vanno usate insieme a terapia, senza o in quale variabili. Quello spetta ai singoli stati che regolano le pratiche psicoterapeute di sviluppare un percorso legislativo per l'uso dell'MDMA in questo caso. Quello che è avvenuto, penso, a livello legislativo è che l'FDA non ha avuto il coraggio di affrontare un percorso simile con una molecola novella, in questo caso come l'MDMA. C'è stata una mancanza di volontà da parte loro.
Ci sono state accuse di abusi sessuali durante i trial di Lykos con MDMA?
Have there been any allegations of sexual misconduct or abuse during the phase 3 trials with MDMA?
No, there have not been.
Ok. Ultima cosa. A quanto ho letto c'è stato un altro problema, secondo me abbastanza grave, che nei trial presentati dai Lykos non sono stati fatti controlli cardiaci e controlli al fegato, ed è strano dato che si tratta di uno stimolante. Puoi spiegarmi come è successo?
So another issue, in my personal opinion, is that there were no cardiac or liver checks conducted during the trials presented by MAPS. This is strange, since MDMA is a stimulant and these data are kind of crucial. How did this happen?
Well, the FDA didn't ask for it, but more importantly, there are over 5,000 papers on MDMA or ecstasy in the scientific literature. The cardiac effects of MDMA are extremely well known. The liver function effects of MDMA are extremely well known. And there's been lots of studies that we've done, actually the phase 1 dose response safety studies. We've looked at heart function in all of the studies. So there are not any real questions about the effect of MDMA on the heart or the effect of MDMA on the liver. Lykos presented all this information from other studies as well as their own studies. So December 11th, 2023, Lykos submitted all of the data to the FDA to start what's called the new drug application process. The FDA has 2 months to review the data to decide whether to, quote, accept to file, whether the data is sufficient for FDA to evaluate safety and efficacy. And FDA concluded that, yes, all the data that they needed to review was in the file. And they said, okay, now we give you priority review, which is a 6-month review, which then went to August 11th, although the response came out August 9th. So there is no real question when you give MDMA 3 times in our therapy set context that there's any harm whatsoever to the heart or to the liver. all of that information was very well known, and the FDA had access to all of that information. And the FDA did not ask for that, anything additional. It's only when the FDA advisory committee said no that then the FDA is looking for things to justify that decision. So there's really no question about, and we already know more than enough to evaluate the risk to the heart and to the liver.
In realtà l'FDA non ha mai richiesto dati su problemi cardiaci o problemi al fegato risultanti dall'uso di MDMA, perché esistono più di 5.000 fogli, papers scientifici, ricerche scientifiche pubblicate sugli effetti cardiaci, sugli effetti sul fegato ed altre funzioni corporali dell'MDMA, quindi è tutto molto molto saputo. Tante domande sono state già risposte da tantissimi studi. Lykos ha mandato tutti i suoi dati a sua disposizione all'FDA e l'FDA ha avuto 2 mesi dopo la consegna dei dati da parte di Lykos per valutare l'approvazione del percorso per la creazione di un nuovo farmaco legalmente disponibile sul mercato. L'FDA ha approvato tutti i dati in suo possesso fornitoli da Lykos con una mozione di priority review, cioè come se fosse una corsia preferenziale. Solamente alla fine del percorso, quando non c'è stata l'approvazione, l'FDA per sbarazzarsi dalla questione ha incominciato, diciamo, a richiedere altri dati, seppur in loro possesso, quindi era semplicemente un tentativo da parte loro di confondere le acque, diciamo.
Ok Rick, ti ringrazio molto. Ti volevo specificare che io ti volevo far dire bene queste cose perché il pubblico italiano non conosce la questione bene come quello americano, quindi è bene spiegare tutto.
Thank you very much, Rick. We had to ask all these different questions because the Italian public is still a bit unknowledgeable on all these aspects, on the research conducted in America. So there is a real heavy need to have all the information available for the larger public as well here, because many people are still living a bit in the dark on what is the state of the current research.
Yeah. I appreciate all your questions. It's important to raise these questions.
Grazie. Io di solito chiudo le puntate di questo podcast di Illuminismo Psichedelico con la frase siamo leggenda, perché ci occupiamo di cose importanti. Dunque, siamo leggenda.
So I usually conclude with the last catchphrase, our podcast here in Italy, as we are legends, because I think it's very important what we're doing, and especially Lumineers like you are doing.
Thank you very much
for this battle.
Yes, thank you, and I look forward to coming to Italy soon.
Yes, we will see in Rovereto, and we will see there.
Looking forward.
Terrific.
Thank you very much, Rick. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.